So we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Game.Set.Deal, a space where we talk about sports and geopolitics. You're with the hosts, Francois and Lorenzo, myself, and our guest for today is Simon Chadwick. Simon is sort of an institution when it comes to sports and geopolitics. He's a researcher, writer, academic, consultant, and speaker with more than 25 years experience in the global sport industry. His work focuses on the geopolitical economy of sport, as I said. He's global professor of Eurasian Sport at Emlyon Business School. He's also director of the Center for Eurasian Sport. Simon has written many articles, books, and research reports for the likes of Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and The Economist, just to name a few. In addition, he has worked with some of the biggest names in sports: Barcelona, UEFA, Adidas, and Coca Cola. So that was quite the introduction, Simon. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I've got to change my LinkedIn profile, make it shorter.
Okay, so I say let's jump right into it. Francois, what is today's topic?
Okay, so just you've probably seen this man around a lot with the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. This is Vladimir Putin. Just to give a brief overview of him before we dive into how he uses sports to advance his political agenda. He was born in '52 in Leningrad then. Now it's back to being St. Petersburg in the Soviet Union. So he grew up during the Cold War when Russian power was at its peak in recent history, at least. Worked for the KGB for 20 plus years, got into politics after the dismantlement of the Soviet Union in the mid-90s, and went on to become president. When he became president, he even said at some point that the dismantlement of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So that kind of tells you a little bit, as a brief introduction, to the kind of strategy, the kind of ambitions that he has for his country. So he's been using many things to do that. The most recent tragic example, obviously, is the invasion of Ukraine. But he's been using sports as well to put himself and his country back in the center of the world, using a concept that we call soft power. So in order to get started nicely, Simon, could you please introduce to us, like in a few words, in general way, what is soft power?
So soft power is attractive power. It's trying to engage audiences around the world by really demonstrating to them or showing them that you care about the same things that they do, and that you share a similar outlook or similar values. But the crucial word in this notion of soft power is power. It's about trying to exert power over others so that you get them to do what you want them to do. And I guess the best way perhaps to illustrate this is by talking about hard power, and you alluded in your introduction to hard power. So hard power is about coercion and aggression, and I guess extreme hard power is military, military campaigns, military attacks, not just threats. You actually do invade and you kill people. But as I say, conversely, soft power doesn't necessarily inflict that level of physical violence or doesn't inflict death on others, but it's very clearly centered upon power and about getting other people to do things that you want them to do.
Okay, so you talked about hard power. You mentioned the invasion in Ukraine. In the context of soft power, what has Russia and Putin in particular done in this regard?
I do have a little bit of an issue of whether this is, or whether we've witnessed Russian soft power, because in some ways it's almost as though it's unique and distinctive what Putin has been seeking to do. So we would normally and ordinarily associate soft power with, for example, some of the things that the British government and the English Premier League do together in terms of teaching English language skills around the world. And we can think too of non-sport examples like Hollywood movies. And I think Hollywood movies are a really important part of American soft power around the world. But what's been happening in Russia over the last 2 decades, I think, is whilst we can say there are elements of soft power, it does seem to be unique and distinctive in the sense that it's almost as though Putin was a boxer, and it's hit them with the right hand and then hit them with the left hand. And one of those hands is what we might call soft power, but the other of those hands is something that is much more aggressive and divisive. And so I wrote recently for a website called The Conversation about the Putinization of sport. And I think the Putinization of sport, that a great example for me is what happened in 2016 and then 2018. Because in 2016, we know that Russian hooligans perpetrated extreme violence against England fans in particular during UEFA Euros in 2016, but also there were several others. So, for example, Polish fans also were attacked by these very well organized, apparently very well funded Russian hooligans. Now, there is a view that these hooligans were effectively recruited by the Kremlin, and they were sent to France during the Euros in 2016 to basically to spread fear and to cause anxiety and to cause division, because, as I say, they targeted particular countries but not others. And so coming out of the Euros in 2016, we had a very negative view of the tournament. Some of us had a very negative view of the tournament, and I think for the English in particular, this was so negative that when it came to the World Cup in 2018, there were only 15,000 English fans in Russia in 2018. And this compares to, for example, there were 60,000 Chinese fans in Russia in 2018 for the World Cup. China didn't even qualify, and yet they had 60,000 fans. England did qualify and got all the way to the semi-finals. There were only 15,000 fans there. And a lot of that was put down to the fear factor. And yet, if you read comments coming from people who were in Russia, and you read the reporting of Russia during 2018, people were making out this was like the best organized World Cup they'd ever been to, a fantastic sporting mega event. The country was incredibly hospitable, very friendly. There was no hint of trouble or violence at all. And so over that 2-year period, we went from something very, very negative to something very, very positive. And for me, that is this kind of left-right, maybe Putin was a boxer, who knows, this kind of left-right, this seductive right hand that is then juxtaposed against this very confrontational and aggressive left hand. And that for me is, I don't know if we would call, as I say, I don't know if you would call this soft power. I think it's something distinctly Russian, and it's something distinctly linked to Vladimir Putin, and hence I called it the Putinization of sport. It's using hard power on the one hand and soft power on the other hand together through sport. And some people have alternatively called this the weaponization of sport, and that effectively what Putin and Russia have done is to weaponize sport.
Okay. So I have a question in that regard. Do you mean that the World Cup, as you can see the Luzhniki Stadium right there, beautiful, it's really beautiful, that picture. Do you mean that you would consider that as a weapon in a different way, for example, that the recent purchase of Newcastle United by the Saudi government? You know what I mean? Like, it's definitely, I think we can all agree, it's a bit different than Hollywood movies or things like that, or Chanel participating in French soft power, we could say. But you think it's actually weaponized like that?
Certainly in the case of what Russia has been doing. For example, if we consider the Russian doping scandal, I think a lot of people have viewed the Russian doping scandal as a doping scandal, which is this is intended to help athletes run faster and jump higher and win more medals. And I think in one sense that is true, because one of the means through which you can project power is by winning lots of medals, and that's a way of exerting some influence across the world. But I also think the doping scandal was a weapon, because essentially what it has done up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, essentially what it had done was to divide the global sporting community, because countries and governments and even the IOC really couldn't get to grips with what should or shouldn't happen. And of course, if we take the IOC, even as recently as the Winter Games in Beijing, Russian athletes were allowed to participate, even though they were competing under a neutral name or a neutral flag. And this kind of division and kind of dissent that this provokes is all part of this weaponization. And so I think that the Russian government has deliberately done this. This is intended to confuse, it's intended to divide, it's intended to drive a wedge between different groups, different individuals, different organizations within certain sports. And he has actually done exactly that. Now, many people have talked in recent weeks that although there is now a military war taking place in Ukraine, that the war is actually longer than that, and the war has been going on for some time. And clearly in sport that war is evident. For example, through the doping scandal. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I think that, in my opinion, it is something different. So I don't necessarily think Saudi Arabia is doing the same things for the same reasons as Russia. The Saudi Arabians have different issues as a country to Russia. We know that their economies are massively dependent on oil and gas. We know that there are issues with, for example, the efficiency of the public sector. There are issues around gender equality. There are issues around the participation of women in sport. There's also the issue too that Saudi Arabia needs to wean itself off this huge dependence on oil and gas, and so they have gone looking for investments. I think too, you've alluded to this several times already about soft power. Is many people across the world don't hold a particularly positive view of Saudi Arabia, and in some cases actually a very, very negative view of Saudi Arabia. And so part of what I think the government in Riyadh has been trying to do is essentially to convince the rest of the world to show to us that they like sport as well, and they like Formula One, and they like football, and they want to be an event host just like us. And so I think there is that element of it. But of course, what some people might see as soft power, other people potentially would see as sport washing. Which soft power and sport washing, I think, is the similarities and differences makes for an interesting conversation in itself, and it's a discussion that's very important to have, I think, particularly in the context of countries like Saudi Arabia.
Sounds good. So I have another question. When it comes to the weaponization of sports, I sort of get okay, like the Kremlin possibly bought people to go fight, to go attack English fans in France. Then you organize an event like the World Cup, football, big sport. I see less the connection with weaponization of sports when, for example, Gazprom becomes sponsor of UEFA, or when someone like Abramovich, who we know to be close to power in Russia, buys Chelsea, or when they organize the Sochi Olympics, which is sports that are practiced, like Winter Olympics, that are practiced by very few countries in the world when we look closely at it. Do you think it serves the same goal, just in a different way than maybe hosting a World Cup does? Or what are the differences in that?
I think your highlighting of the Gazprom case in particular is a really pertinent illustration, and I think very aptly helps to describe or to summarize what has been happening. And keep in mind that Gazprom has been a sponsor of European football for not quite 20 years, but certainly heading in that direction. So it first agreed its deal with the Bundesliga's Schalke in, I think, 2006 or 2007. And essentially what Putin and the Kremlin have been seeking to do over the last 20 years is to build European energy dependence upon Russia. And in Germany, this is a country with somewhere around 40 to 50% of its gas needs being met by Russia, which has built over the last 2 decades. And once there is a dependence upon something, if you're dependent upon someone, or you're dependent upon an organization, or if you're dependent upon a country, with dependence comes power. And that country or that person or that organization can exert power over you. And this is exactly what has happened in Germany. And the way in which the Gazprom sponsorship deal, initially with Schalke, but subsequently with UEFA as well, has been used is, at one level we could call it soft power. We can frame it in another way, is in the sense that it's been a set of sponsorships designed to seduce and to deliver legitimacy. And so even though Gazprom has been a Champions League sponsor since 2013, most of us just haven't questioned this company. Most of us haven't pointed out some of the issues. Most football fans, rather than telling you about the links to Putin and the Kremlin, will have told you, yeah, I know Gazprom, and I see them on TV coverage, or I see them pitch side when there are Champions League games on. Yet in reality, what Gazprom has been doing is very quietly and very gently but nevertheless very resolutely legitimizing its activities and almost distracting people away from its real intentions. And its real intentions, as I say, were to create this gas dependency in Europe upon Russia. Probably one of the most high-profile people, ironically, probably one of the most high-profile people to start calling this was Donald Trump in kind of 2018, and saying, look, there's a real problem with Russian gas dependence in Europe, particularly in Germany. And so I don't think the Schalke deal was a coincidence. It was very deliberate. It was very provocative. But as I say, it was a very subtle and almost surreptitious way of Russia and Russian gas gaining a foothold in Europe. I guess what we didn't anticipate is that having got to a dependence of 40 to 50% on Russian gas, Germany very quickly said, end, that's it. So kind of 3-4 weeks ago. And similarly with UEFA, having only just signed a renewal deal with Gazprom last year to 2024, I think it is, UEFA similarly just cut this off immediately. So this is something that none of us, I think, anticipated. But of course, by this stage, or by that stage, Russia had been able to accumulate some degree of power over European energy markets. And sports sponsorship and an involvement in sport more generally on Gazprom's part had enabled Russia to do that.
Okay, so to add another element to Russian soft power, we talked about the World Cup now with Gazprom. As Abramovich played a role in this as well. We know the oligarchs in Russia are very close to the Kremlin. Would you consider that part of this whole strategy?
That's a really good question, because I don't think any of us are entirely clear about why Abramovich was there at Chelsea and at Stamford Bridge. There are many reports of how Abramovich got rich. There are many reports of what Abramovich's relationship with Putin actually is. And yet many of these are unsubstantiated or they're unconfirmed. And so we're still left to speculate why exactly it was that Abramovich appeared in West London in the first place. Now, of course, the good thing about this is we can speculate. And what we do know is Abramovich has survived. And this is a really important detail, because if Abramovich wasn't still alive, he may well have fallen victim as a critic of Putin. He would have fallen victim to possible murder or execution, if we could put it that way. Abramovich is still alive, but not only that, he's still rich. And again, the fact that he's rich says something. So the fact that Abramovich is alive and is still rich suggests that there are connections, probably very strong connections to Putin, which then leads into the question. So, okay, so what's Abramovich been doing? Well, I guess at one level, what Abramovich has been able to do is move some assets offshore. So for any dictator anywhere in the world, they always run the danger of potentially being overthrown. And of course, if you're a dictator and you're overthrown, what do you do for money? Particularly because your bank account domestically, will be frozen. So what you do is you take some of the assets, some of your ill-gotten gains, and you park them somewhere. You put them somewhere where it's actually pretty easy to put them. So there are going to be few questions asked. There are not going to be very many restrictions. And whenever you need that money, you can go there and you can liquidate your asset. And so I think that is one possibility that we shouldn't discount, is that money that has been put into Chelsea and the value of the club as it is now, in part, could well be Putin's wealth. And we've heard stories over the last 2 or 3 weeks that many people believe that Abramovich could be effectively Putin's money man, Putin's banker. So he invests money for Putin overseas. But I think as well, at the same time, there is this view that essentially what Abramovich at Chelsea has enabled is for Russian money to be deployed or invested across professional football, possibly for multiple reasons, but without scrutiny and with impunity. And we add to this some of the things that I said earlier. Is most of us haven't. Most football fans haven't really questioned Abramovich. He's become something of a British institution. Instead of thinking, well, this is dirty money linked to the Kremlin, most people are thinking, wow, great players. And, we think about Lampard and Drogba and, Havertz and Mason Mount and all the rest of these players. And instead of asking difficult questions and confronting difficult realities, instead, many people have celebrated the sport. And I guess that what many in turn would say about that is that's classic sport washing. Whether it's sport washing or not, I think is a big debate. But again, one of the things that I would say is that essentially Abramovich gained legitimacy. And what we do know is that very wealthy Russians have sought legitimacy, particularly in London, because there are some fairly strong opinions out there that effectively London has become the money laundering capital of the world. And so Russian oligarchs, Russian billionaires have been able to launder their money through the City of London, through the financial institutions in the City of London. And what we do know is that there are some very prominent Russians living in London who potentially could have been facilitators of that money laundering. So it's difficult to reach any firm conclusions about Abramovich, but what we do know is there are lots of possible scenarios. There are lots of possible reasons why, for nearly the last 20 years, he has been spending excessive amounts of money in West London.
So bouncing back on that and getting, I guess, opening up to different cases than just the Abramovich case, because it's an interesting one, but it's actually the only one that got sanctioned. And for me, as a Monaco fan, for example, I know the owner, Rybolovlev, is also Russian. He also has money. He must also be somewhat linked to the Kremlin. I mean, I don't really know, but we can maybe assume he didn't get sanctioned yet. I mean, maybe that's going to come. I don't know. The other question that comes to mind then is for European football and European sports in general, mainly football, because that's where the most money is involved and the most fans and things like that. But We talked about Russia in the case of Abramovich, but when we see that PSG, the biggest club in one of the biggest cities in Europe, is owned by Qataris, that now Nasser Al-Khelaifi is now president of the European Club Association. So basically, European Club Association is directed by, indirectly, the government of Qatar, that Emirates, the Emirati government has contracts all over with Arsenal. They own Manchester City. They have contracts with Real Madrid. Some businessmen, Chinese businessman owns Inter Milan. I mean, you see where I'm going with this, right? Like, what should we as Europeans, like, who, if any sanctions or any limits should be put to that? Like, first of all, should we put limits? And then who should put them? Is it the European Union? Is it the UEFA? Is it the FIFA? Who is it?
So as Europeans, I'm of the view that we've been sleepwalking into this situation. So many Europeans believe that our clubs and our leagues are the best in the world, and that, of course, lots and lots of different organizations would want to invest money or spend money in our football, whether it's buying Monaco or sponsoring Arsenal or engaging in a partnership with Bayern Munich. Of course, they would want to do that because European football's the best, right? That's this kind of preconception, and I got to say, somewhat ignorant preconception that many Europeans have had. I tend to see things in terms of three periods. I mean, there was that period of history when European clubs were owned by Europeans and local people. You know the kind of thing where your local football club was owned by a local business person, and it was because that local business person was proud of their city, proud of their town. They wanted to show support for local people, sort of show that the town is successful, and then along came another group of people and said, well, actually, we think you should run these clubs on a more commercial basis. And at clubs like Manchester United or at Liverpool or at Roma or AC Milan, they were Americans. And let's be clear about this. Most American investors in European football are not interested in the football. They're interested in the money. Some people did ask questions about that, but even so, I think a lot of fans, so long as teams were winning, so long as teams were doing well, they were happy to accept this. And I think there were even some fans were happy about this, because we very often celebrate that our club is number 1 in the money league, or number 5 in the money league, or number 10 in the money league. But that kind of money league football was very different to the 19th century origins and early 20th century origins that have shaped many of our engagements with football. So, but just as we've made this kind of transition from football as a socio-cultural phenomenon and into football as a financial or a commercial phenomenon, what we now have is football as a geopolitical phenomenon. And keeping in mind, whether we're talking about Russia or China or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Abu Dhabi or for that matter, Azerbaijan investing in a sponsorship deal with Atletico Madrid, or you think about the family that owns Leicester City and its connections to the Thai government. These are a different group of people again. So they don't really care about, they're not really interested in Madrid as such. They're not really interested in Leicester as such. So they're not fans motivated by socio-cultural influences, but at the same time, they're not necessarily specifically or solely interested in financial return either. They could be, but for them, I think for the different organizations, entities, countries that I've mentioned, they're interested in investing in football for geopolitical reasons. And this, for many Europeans, this appears to be a new thing. It's not, Abramovich was there 20 years ago. Abramovich bought into Chelsea nearly 20 years ago. So it's not a new phenomenon, but we're now gradually waking up to this. And so where I think this leaves us in European football is with a very simple question, as you mentioned, is what do we want? What kind of football do we want? And if we look at, for instance, the reaction at Chelsea to what has been happening over recent weeks, you've got some Chelsea fans who are still chanting Abramovich's name in spite of everything. You've got other members of the Chelsea fan base who are actually very deeply suspicious now of what Abramovich has done and what potentially he could still do. But then you've also got members of the Chelsea fan base who are also beginning to question, for example, some of the North American investors who potentially may invest into the club. So I guess what we've got is this kind of ideological juxtaposition with lots of people disagreeing about what the best way forward is. And the issue then becomes, well, how do you sort out this mess? And somebody put it that starkly to me early this morning, is how do you sort out the mess? And I think that Europe needs to get savvy. Europe needs to become more strategic in thinking about who owns its sport and who runs its sport, because the Saudi Arabians take this kind of thing seriously, the Qataris take this kind of thing seriously, the Russians take this kind of thing seriously. In Europe, in Western Europe, we haven't.
So on that, sorry, but just to really bounce back on what you just said, Europe needs to take this seriously. But do you think it has to come from like the fans in themselves? For example, we can see the power they had in stopping the Super League from happening. Should it come from us, European citizens? I'm saying because we're 3 Europeans here, or should it come from the governments that have sanctioned Abramovich, for example? Should it come from the leagues that each individually control, or the UEFA?
So I don't think the fans stopped the Super League. I think that's an urban myth that they stopped the Super League. It was a little bit like it was a bit like the final scene in Reservoir Dogs. I think the Super League clubs all shot themselves. That is what happened. It wasn't the fans. The fans might like to believe that, and I think politicians would have us believe that somehow fan power overcame everything else. I don't think that's the case. I think it was the clubs themselves that they destroyed themselves. But that does still raise the question about, are fans going to be powerful enough to change the situation that we now find ourselves in? My view is that the fans have an important role to play, and that the fans do have some power to shape the future of football. The difficulty is really two difficulties. Number one is the fans alone can't do this. They're going to need help. They're going to need help from governments. They're going to need help from governing bodies. But I think there also needs to be some common understanding established between fans and, for example, broadcasters and commercial partners, with the clubs themselves. So that's one part of it. And I think the other thing too around this is that with the fans themselves, fans don't agree. We're not all the same. So there are those fans who, this is about your heart and your soul and your community and your identity and where you were born and where you were brought up. But not all fans are like that. Some fans are, if you could say, kind of new generations of fans who've been brought up on and consume their football based on big celebrities and big TV contracts and big money. And for older fans to say to those younger fans, right, okay, we're going to go back to 1970, and we're going to we're going back to how it used to be. Younger fans don't understand that. They don't know what that means. And I think the other thing as well, of course, is we now live in a globalized world whereby Manchester United fans are not necessarily in Manchester. And for that matter, Juventus fans are not necessarily in Turin, and Real Madrid fans are not necessarily in Madrid. And so the question is, who are these fans? So we have an incredibly complicated and complex environment with lots of competing pressures and lots of competing stakeholders. And I go back to that very simple generalization, how do we sort out this mess? Well, I guess in essence, there are two extremes. Is you just leave the mess to itself and see how it sorts itself out, which is a kind of a free market solution. Or we see more interventionist approaches. And personally, I've always felt that the European Union should play a much more prominent role in intervening and regulating. Quite how they do that, I think, is an interesting debate in its own right. Or maybe there's a kind of socially democratic approach, which is neither free market nor interventionist. But I do think whichever approach that we adopt, we're now in a moment in football history where we're all kind of waking up to the harsh and sometimes very cruel reality of the way in which football clubs are owned and operated and the way in which they function. And you either accept it or you don't. And if we don't accept it, we need to be thinking about ways of moving forward. And that can't just be fans on their own.
So just very, very briefly, I understood your three options, like sort of interventionist, in between, or just letting it go. Assuming that we would want to change things, then you talked about the position of the European Union, which is kind of complicated, knowing that just about half of the members of UEFA, of European football, are members of the European Union. Would a super league be a solution then? Just briefly.
I think the basic premise that, or the angle that I come at this from is, would France sell the Eiffel Tower to the Qataris, or would the British sell Buckingham Palace to the Saudi Arabians? And I think we know the answer to those two questions is no. And yet we have been prepared to sell our socio-cultural assets, our socio-cultural institutions to foreign investors. So these are European, they're not only cultural assets, but they're industrial assets as well. And so essentially we're now in the position that if we take Paris Saint-Germain as an example, this is now Qatari owned. And so the financial benefits and the social capital that is generated through Paris Saint-Germain is as much Qatar's as it is anybody else's. It's as much Qatar's as it is Paris's or France's. Are we happy with that situation? Yes or no? And if we are, then okay, great. If as Europeans we decide we're perfectly cool with this, fine, okay. We've decided that. But if we've decided it's unacceptable, so the question then becomes, what are you going to do? Now, one of the options that European football may, particularly football in the European Union, may therefore contemplate is one of the best ways to protect these cultural assets, these industrial assets in football that we have, could be to create a super league that essentially generates revenues, ensures that there is money coming into the game, that we remain in control of our football, and that the revenues that are generated from our football don't go to Qatar, don't go to Abu Dhabi, don't go to Saudi Arabia, don't go to China. They actually stay inside Europe. But then, of course, the issue becomes, well, if you're going to have a super league, what happens to everybody else in Europe? And that is another question again, and trying to understand. I think for me, if there was ever to be a super league, what we've got to do as Europeans is make sure that super league benefits other Europeans. And that is not just in terms of other European clubs, but grassroots football, grassroots sport around Europe. And it's these kinds of issues, debates. I could sit here for the rest of the day talking about this. Obviously, we don't have time to do that. But I think this is the kind of conversation and debate that what has happened through Abramovich and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the kind of debate that is now being provoked. And it's great to talk about it, and it's great to raise the issues, and it's important that many people are clear about what's happening. But the next step now is, okay, so we've identified the problem. What are the solutions? And I think at this particular moment in time, we're not really doing that. And so I think as we move forward from here, we need some solutions.
But do you see, what are the odds of that happening? Like, for example, I think about football agents. What they earn basically is money that gets out of the football industry. And it seems to me that neither UEFA or FIFA have been able to regulate that. So I think you could say in European institutions haven't really shown any power and taken any actual decisions to regulate that. So do you actually think there's possibility to regulate all that, or as a personal opinion?
In simple terms, if we take FIFA as an example, FIFA organizes football matches. They've got some grassroots development work, and they're kind of custodians or guardians of football in that sense. These people are not politicians. They're not national government. They might think they're important. The people working at FIFA might think they're important, but in reality, the real power in the world is still in the hands of governments. And what we've seen with Putin in Russia, what we see with Saudi Arabia, and all these other countries that we've mentioned already during this recording, is that they deploy their governments. So decisions about spending in football are being made by their governments. So the Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia that is invested into Newcastle United, this is government owned. This is a government fund. Whereas in Europe, we don't have the kind of the clout, as we would say in English. That we don't have the clout or the power or the will of governments to do this. And I think that if we are, as Europeans, going to address the challenges that we now face, we can't look to governing bodies, because they just won't do it. Because I don't think the governing bodies see themselves as needing to or having to do this. But as I say, at the same time, they're not political organizations. They organize football matches. So we should be looking to, we should be looking to the French government. We should be looking to the British government. We should be looking to the European Union to create these solutions. Because unless we do that, we're essentially talking about private individuals and investors trying to take actions in the face of the might of the Saudi Arabian state, the Chinese state, the Russian state, and I just don't think it's possible for one person or one group of investors or a set of football fans to do that. It really needs the clout, the pressure, the strength, the will of government institutions in Europe to address it. But government institutions, including the European Union, don't seem able to get their heads around this. There isn't the political will, there isn't the coordination. There doesn't seem to be the level of understanding that's needed, or maybe they just don't care. And yet I think this is a really, really serious issue that Europe now is having to confront. And I think, thanks to Abramovich and what's happened to Chelsea, this has raised these issues up the agenda.
Okay, so I think we're a little bit over 45 minutes. We can wrap it up. Okay. I think we could, I feel like we only scratched the surface. We could go on, I think, for hours, especially you. But I think everyone got a good grasp of the subject.
Okay, so we need a documentary series next week and the week after and the week after and the week after and the week after.
Yeah, we could actually do that.
Yeah.
It would have enough to talk about. So thank you, Simon, for joining us, and all those who listened until now. You can find more what Simon does on Twitter. We'll leave all the links in the description. You can also follow us on Instagram at Game.Set.Deal for more content of sport and geopolitics and to stay updated on future episodes. So I'll see you in the next one.